Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research virtually. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO. And we're so thrilled to have you here for another installment of our Yiddish Civilization lecture series. This is a series meant for both our Yiddish summer program students and also for the broader public to immerse themselves in the world, in the breadth and the depth of Yiddish language, culture, and history and civilization. We're so pleased to have you all here with us, and we're very pleased to have Sonia Gollance today, speaking about Taya Artsychevska's Miryeml and Yiddish plays by women. Before I offer Sonia's formal bio, I'm going to invite up David Brown, the academic director of our summer program, to say a few words.
My few words are simply blessings to Sonia. Great to see you. Thank you for taking part in this series. And I look forward to what you have to say. I've been looking forward to what you say since we met in the summer of 2007. Or was it 2007. 2007. That's all I have to say. Okay. Good luck.
Dr. Sonia Gollance is lecturer in Yiddish at the University College in London. Her research interests include Yiddish studies, German Jewish literature, gender studies, and performance studies. She has taught previously at the University of Vienna, the Ohio State University, and the University of Göttingen. Her book, It Could Lead to Dancing, Mixed Sex Dancing and Jewish Modernity, Stanford University Press 2021, was a National Jewish Book Award finalist. Her ongoing translation of Taya Artsychevska's play, Miriam Mole, was supported by a translation fellowship from the Yiddish Book Center. She's currently developing a project on women who wrote plays in Yiddish. In addition to her scholarship, she is also a Yiddish dance leader. Dr. Gollance, welcome. Thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. All right, so thank you for the introductions. And it's such an honor as an alum of the YIVO summer program to speak here today. And I just want to note that I'll be discussing a play that's about children, about how they experienced the Holocaust, but it's not a play for children. So I will read or display some passages where children talk about things like death and murder. Six years ago, I was recruited to join the Digital Yiddish Theatre Project, a research consortium that uses digital humanities tools to study and share information about Yiddish theater. Since its founding in 2012 by Joel Berkowitz and Deborah Kaplan, the DYTP has published online open access essays, interviews, performance reviews, and translations by theatrical practitioners, research librarians, and scholars in higher education, who are among the world's leading authorities on Yiddish theater and drama. And if you have any interest in Yiddish theater, I definitely recommend visiting the website. When I was approached in 2016, the DYTP had a new initiative called Plotting Yiddish Drama, which would be a searchable online database of Yiddish play synopses. And I was invited to be the managing editor for this new initiative.
Sonia, so sorry to interrupt, but when you switch back, we just see the first slide again. Okay. So yeah, now we're seeing the third slide, but now we're seeing the first slide. Yeah.
Okay, so I will read it from my laptop.
Okay, very good.
All good. Sorry for the weird angles that you might see now. All right. So at the time that I started as managing editor, I was a graduate student in the last year of my PhD, and my research focused much more on dance, literature, and gender studies than on theater. I knew that there would be a learning curve, but it turned out that my status as a newcomer also gave me a helpful perspective in building the database. One of the first things we did after I joined was to write a wish list of 250 plays that we wanted to eventually see included in our database. At first, I wasn't sure how much I'd be able to contribute to the list as someone who was new to the field. Yet when I took a look at the 250 Yiddish plays, I realized that only 2 of them were written by women. Or to be more precise, they were both written by the same woman, Kadia Malodowski, and she was the only female playwright represented on the list. My colleagues are wonderful scholars and feminists, yet the fact that they had not thought to include more female playwrights underscores how Yiddish plays by women writers have been almost completely overlooked by scholars and are only just now starting to get more attention from translators and dramaturgs. I soon realized that one of my goals as managing editor of Plotting Yiddish Drama would be to uncover more plays that were written by women. As a result of my efforts, approximately 20% of our current synopses are of plays written by women. As I became more involved in these efforts, I decided that I wanted to write more about this topic, including a future academic book about Yiddish women playwrights. I also began to look for a play to translate. In 2018, when I was visiting the Yiddish Book Center, bibliographer David Mazauer showed me a copy of Taya Artsychevska's Miryeml, a modernist play about the Holocaust from the perspective of children. This haunting, sophisticated drama by a fascinating yet now mostly forgotten writer was like nothing I had seen before. And I realized that I had found my translation project. In my work editing Plotting Yiddish Drama, I have access to dozens of synopses of canonical and more obscure works of Yiddish drama. I have not yet encountered anything like Miriam Mole. Anthologies of Yiddish writing about the Holocaust rarely include dramatic work. Yet dramatic works. There's lots of drama in various directions, but works that for the stage. Yet Miriam Mole stands out even in comparison with other post-war Yiddish plays about the Holocaust, since Miriam Mole's topic and style of narration are unique. Arciszewska's play is a modernist work that deftly integrates 20th century history and Jewish folklore into a narrative about children's response to trauma. Today, I'm going to tell you about this translation project and about the fascinating life of Taya Artsychevska. I'll start by talking about women who wrote plays in Yiddish, continue by presenting Arciszewska's life and discussing the development and reception of her play Miryeml, and then discuss several motifs and passages I find particularly significant. Feminist scholarship has increased our awareness of the literary achievements of women who wrote in Yiddish. Particularly since the 1980s and 1990s, there have been a number of important academic monographs, collected scholarly volumes, and translations which illuminate the contributions of Yiddish women writers. Poetry was the first genre to draw scholarly attention, followed by short stories. A number of memoirs have also been translated and used for historical research. Women's participation in newspapers and literary journals has begun to garner interest. In contrast with other literary traditions, where novels were viewed as a feminine genre, scholarship of Yiddish language novels by women was virtually non-existent until recently. Generally speaking, we are experiencing a welcome boom in translations and scholarship of Yiddish women writers, although there is still much work to be done. Scholarship of plays by women in Yiddish has lagged behind awareness of women's participation in these other Yiddish literary genres. Numerous women writers who have received recent attention for their work in other genres, including Kadia Malodowski, Chava Rosenfarb, and Miriam Karpelov, also wrote plays, yet these dramatic works have generally been neglected and certainly gained less attention than their prose or poetry. Perhaps the clearest example of this discrepancy is the reception of modernist Fradl Stock, who wrote celebrated poems, short stories that received mixed reviews, and an English language novel that was critically unsuccessful, and all of this was well documented. Yet for decades, the play manuscript she copyrighted hid in plain sight at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. One reason for this lack of awareness could be that plays are often only published after they have first been produced, and a manuscript in the archives generally receives less scholarly attention than a publication, regardless of genre. Yet even playwrights who did publish their plays, such as Jane Rose, have languished in obscurity, although in an exciting development, Alona Bach is now working on a translation of one of Rose's plays. Many works by women playwrights are melodramas known as shund, a genre that has generally received less attention than works with greater literary ambitions. There is also an overall tendency in Yiddish theater scholarship to focus primarily on actresses rather than the many other ways women were involved with the Yiddish stage. Yet these boundaries could be fluid since actresses were involved in writing their own material. And as we learned last week from Nina Varnka's talk, there are still so many unanswered questions about actresses on the Yiddish stage, some of which will be answered by the forthcoming volume, Women on the Yiddish Stage, which is co-edited by Miriam Chaya Siegel and Alyssa Quint. Even though women wrote plays in the heyday of Yiddish theater, and some were even produced, works by women have only just barely entered the Yiddish dramatic canon. Scholars and translators have only very recently begun to address this neglect. Since 2015, there have been a number of new translations of plays by women that have been performed, but not yet published. Growing interest in readings and stagings of works by women, mostly in an online virtual format, and one academic article by Deborah Kaplan that discusses Molodovsky's plays. My article on a play by the Shomer sisters is forthcoming in Ingeveb, a journal of Yiddish studies, which as far as I know, will only be the second academic article on Yiddish plays by women writers. The Yiddish Book Center's Translation Fellowship and the National Yiddish Theater Volksbühne's Yiddish Women Playwright Series, originally curated by Sabina Bruckner, have also brought greater attention to dramatic works by women writers. At the same time, to my knowledge, no Yiddish play by a woman has yet been published in its entirety in translation in any language, although this situation is expected to change within the year. My translated edition of Miriam Mole will contribute to this larger project of bringing awareness to the creative achievements of women who wrote plays in Yiddish. And so here we have some examples of plays written by women that are in the Plotting Yiddish Drama database. You can find the synopses online. Although she is now largely forgotten, Taya Artsychevska was a mesmerizing figure in the Warsaw Yiddish culture scene on account of her many Yiddish theater achievements and her participation in Yiddish literary circles, as well as for her life as a bohemian. As Mark Turkov put it in 1954, quote, "She deserves to have a whole book written about her, owing to her immense accomplishments in Yiddish cultural life in Poland, thanks to the assistance she rendered Jewish artists in Poland over the course of many decades, and, why deny it, also due to the tempestuous romantic life she led," end quote. In recent years, Arciszewska has received attention for her involvement in Jewish artistic circles, yet her contributions to Yiddish theater and Yiddish literature deserve further examination. And here we have some recent scholarship about Arciszewska by myself and others. Arciszewska was born in 1890 to the Lipski family, illustrious Ger Hasidim, in a shtetl called Mława in Congress, Poland, the part of Poland controlled by the Russian Empire following the Napoleonic Wars. Despite the pious family environment, she and her two sisters each pursued a career in the arts. Sarah Lipska became a painter and Liba a dancer. At age 16, Arciszewska met her first husband, the artist Shimon Kratka, and in the face of her family's disapproval, the young couple eloped to Palestine and spent several years there, while Kratka was affiliated with the Bezalel Art Academy. They then moved to Warsaw and became part of Eyal Peretz's renowned literary circle. In his epic 7-volume memoir of Jewish literary life in early 20th century Warsaw, Yudid Trunk, or YY Trunk, devotes 2 chapters to the couple, whom he regards as exotic on account of their travels, and perhaps also due to Arciszewska's exceptional Hasidic pedigree. He describes the sensation created by Arciszewska, or Tocha, as he calls her more intimately. Not many ladies or interesting women would visit Peretz. Yiddish literature was never considered that important by the women of the bourgeoisie and educated circles of Polish Jewish society. People looked down on it and saw culture and beauty only in Polish writings. Nevertheless, there were exceptions. Tocha, however, eclipsed the other women in Peretz's literary circle. As if a Jewish muse had descended from the heavens, she was art itself, dressed in a feminine petticoat. And what a petticoat! Pure olive oil and Torah covers. Trunk's chapter emphasizes the role of material objects, especially the antiquities that Arciszewska and Kratka brought back from Palestine. Arciszewska herself recalled in 1954, quote, "Peretz bestowed a lot of his time and artistic effort on me, since he maintained that I was the one who was capable of creating and embodying his female characters on stage," end quote. As Trunk notes, Arciszewska was one of the few women in this social set, and a number of her contemporaries claim that the teenaged bohemian became a muse to Peretz, who was nearly 4 decades her senior. In his book Itzik Leibich Peretz und das Jiddische Theater, Itzik Leibich Peretz and the Yiddish Theater, theater critic Alexander Mukdoini claims that she was, quote, "the personification of the Polish Jewish woman in his dramas," end quote. Peretz recruited Arciszewska as an actress for his project to create a more artistic Yiddish theater company, and gave her the stage name Miriam Israels, which she used starting in 1910 as she performed in plays such as Peretz's Zbrent, It's Burning, which you can learn more about on the Plotting Yiddish Drama database. In 1925, she founded the renowned Azazel Theater Troupe in collaboration with such talents as director David Herman, the first director of Szymanski's play, or Asamski's play, Der Dybbuk, the Dybbuk, a great hit of the Vilna troupe. And so here we see an example of Arciszewska being viewed as sort of an embodiment of Polish Jewish womanhood, where she's acting as an artist's model for either Queen Esther or Esterka, in a painting by Marysi Minkowski. And here we have an advertisement for the Azazel Theater Troupe. And here we see Arciszewska's name listed as one of the as one of the artistic directors. After surviving World War II, Arciszewska moved to Paris and finished her play Miryeml, which she had begun before the war. In 1954, Miryeml received the Alexander Shapiro Prize for Best Yiddish Drama from the World Jewish Culture Congress. In 1958, the play was published in book form in Canada by Melech Ravitch, with an introduction comprised of 3 letters by American Yiddish modernist Yosef Opatoshu, who came from the same town in Poland as Arciszewska, and he had passed away in 1954, which is probably why he didn't write a specific introduction for the work. Instead, it's letters that he had written to her previously. And here we have a picture of Opatoshu. Another edition was printed in Paris by Goldena Pava in 1959, just 1 year after the Canadian edition. Miryeml was honored by the gatekeepers of Yiddish literary taste. This recognition is particularly striking because so little attention has been paid to plays written by women in Yiddish, and yet Miryeml is virtually unknown today. Miryeml is a Yiddish language dramatic cycle in 15 scenes about pogroms, and the Holocaust from the perspective of Polish Hasidic children who make sense of their circumscribed reality through games and stories about rebbes. The play takes its name from the protagonist Miryeml, whose name recalls the biblical prophetess Miriam. She suffers from a mental illness and often disturbs the other children with her morbid comments, which are frequently delivered in rhyme, and this presents an interesting challenge for me as a translator. By the end of the play, Miryeml becomes a prophet-like figure who leads the children from Warsaw towards, she claims, Jerusalem. Miryeml is one of the most extraordinary characters I have encountered in Yiddish literature. In the play's list of characters, which you can see here, her tragic circumstances are described with brutal efficiency. And here's a quote of my translation for that, the description for Miryeml. You can follow along in the Yiddish if you so choose. Mentally ill, 13 to 14 years old, daughter of a judge in a religious court, orphan, end quote. These attributes suggest a very difficult life. Normally, a female orphan with a mental illness would be viewed as a marginal figure in East European Jewish society, as Natan Meir has discussed in his book, Stepchildren of the Shtetl. What is more, this play is set in the context of pogroms and the Holocaust, when perpetrators considered such individuals, especially if they were Jewish, to be expendable. Yet Miryeml is at the very center of Arciszewska's magnum opus. Her madness is that of a holy fool or a prophet, and her suffering symbolizes the pain of European Jewish children in some of the grimmest moments of the 20th century. Depending on her mood, she is wise, tender, biting, poignant, fearful, or prophetic in turn, and her speech can sound like incantations or like some of the most haunting modernist dramas. M. Waldman's 1962 obituary of Arciszewska in the Freie Arbeiterstimme discusses the significance of this character. Here we have a picture of her from the 1958 edition, and quote here, Miryeml herself is a strange sort of figure, not fully real, adorned in mystic veils. She sometimes speaks like a clown, a mocker. Her words scald as if they were made of fire. But this same Miryeml also possesses the power of prophecy. She knows the tragic face of time, but also has the power of announcing renewal. Through Miryeml, who expresses the unhappiness and suffering of millions of Jewish children, Taya Artsychevska erected a tombstone that will last for generations. While most Yiddish play translations are from the heyday of Yiddish theater, from the late 19th to early 20th centuries, Miryeml is a post-war work that juxtaposes Jewish folklore with modernist motifs. Although children do appear in plays about the Holocaust, like The Diary of Anne Frank and Leopoldstadt, it is unusual for a text about the Holocaust to highlight the experience of a female adolescent with a mental illness. Another surprising feature of the play is that it is very vague about who precisely is persecuting the children and why they need to hide in cellars for large portions of the play. Although it is not always obvious from the text how directly Arciszewska wanted to address the Holocaust, it is clear that Opatoshu viewed the play as a response to the Chorban, the Yiddish word for Holocaust, since he wrote in a 1953 letter to Arciszewska, quote, "You have written something powerful. I have not encountered such images and scenes in the dozens of books which have already been written about the Holocaust," end quote. With regards to its modernism, topic, and critical acclaim, Miryeml challenges our expectations of Yiddish dramas and Yiddish women's writing. Arciszewska wrote Miryeml over the course of several tumultuous decades, beginning the play in 1920s Warsaw and completing it in 1950s Paris. Most of what I've been able to find out about her process of creation comes from the writings of her male contemporaries. These memoirs, essays, and newspaper writings provide intriguing details about the development of Arciszewska's major work. At the same time, basic questions remain unanswered, such as if the play was ever read publicly or performed, and whether Arciszewska was able to preserve earlier drafts of Miryeml during World War II, or if she recreated her work entirely from memory post-war. Yet although these accounts can be enigmatic, they do shed light on two major issues. First of all, they give us a sense of how to interpret the play's historical context, even though it seems to exist outside of time, since it is vague about the identity of the perpetrators. Second, these accounts give a sense of the reception history and an uncomfortable reminder of the misogyny which colored the critical reception of so many Yiddish women writers. I'll address these two issues using texts written by Arciszewska's contemporaries, and I'm translating a number of these sources as well to include as an appendix to my play translation. In his 1962 obituary in the Vorwärts, Leon Lennemann describes the changing historical context of Miryeml. It is unclear from this account which changes Arciszewska made in content between the 1920s and 1950s. Lennemann describes an early draft as a long poem and calls the final version a dramatic poem, so it is possible that Arciszewska shifted the genre of her work, although a quote by Melech Ravitch, I'll show you soon, refers to the earlier draft as a play. It's also hard to tell the pace at which Arciszewska worked on Miryeml over the years. Did she frequently revise her work, or did she edit in spurts? Lennemann focuses on how Arciszewska depicts the impact of recent traumas on Polish Jewish children. Initially, according to Lennemann, this trauma meant pogroms, since he writes, "Yet even back then, Taya Artsychevska had begun to write her most original work, which was originally conceived as an elegy to the Jewish children who were killed in pogroms at the end of World War I. As scholars such as Elisa Bemperad, Jacqueline Granick, and Jeffrey Weidlinger have discussed in recent studies, there was a terrible wave of pogroms in 1918 and 1919 in Eastern Europe. The first scene of the published version of Miryeml ends with a pogrom that takes place off stage. Melech Ravitch claims in a 1966 anthology that the play is set during World War I. Okay, I'll get to that in a moment. So the play Miryeml cannot be fully separated from the context of pogroms. Incidents of violence against Jews in the play are described as pogroms, including in a particularly troubling scene in which a group of Jewish boys decides to make a pogrom as a game. And this clearly shows their feelings of powerlessness that they are trying, and the things that they've seen, and how they're somehow trying to resolve these sorts of emotions through this cruel game. Yet at the same time, Lennemann thinks that after 1945, the play should be understood as a work which depicts the Holocaust. He writes, and now we get to this quote, "Many years passed, and when Taya Artsychevska returned to the elegy and completed it, the tragedy of the Jewish child had already developed in terrifying ways. And the long poem also developed until it became Miryeml, the dramatic poem that laments with such power and at the same time with such gentle sensitivity the tragedy of the million exterminated Jewish children." Lennemann's interpretation of Miryeml as a Holocaust play was shared by contemporaries like Opatoshu. Waldman also describes Miryeml explicitly as a work about the Holocaust in his obituary in the Freie Arbeiterstimme, writing about the play as if Arciszewska had been pregnant with it for decades. He writes, "She carried her own great drama to term, bringing to expression the tragedy of the Jewish child in pogroms and the Holocaust. It took her years to create this work. Miryeml was her life's goal and also her greatest literary achievement." While the play's temporal setting is vague, in a speech in scene 7, Miryeml prophesies a vast number of funerals, declaring, quote, a million, another a million, again a million, and a million again, a million funerals. So if you're watching my fingers or counting, the total number of funerals she predicts is 6 million, a number equal to the rounded estimate of Jews killed in the Holocaust. This number suggests that Arciszewska also viewed her play in connection with the Holocaust. I have another example as well. So similarly, in scene 4, after elderly Reb Yisroel dies, the children stand by his corpse and tell him messages to bring to God and to the world to come. Menachem Mole, a 6 or 7-year-old orphan, offers heartbreaking words that suggest the mass deportations, murder, and cremations of Jews in the Holocaust, rather than the less systematic violence associated with World War I. And so we have this quote here. So Menachem Mole says, "Tell the master of the universe that they left me all alone. They took Papa and Mama far away. I don't know where. Tell my mama that she tricked me. She said, Menachem Mole, be quiet, pray to God that I return soon. But she didn't come back." Miriam Mole, "You innocent fool. They've burned her to ash." Menachem Mole, "I know, but when she does come back, she shouldn't forget about me." This exchange between two orphaned children is devastating. They speak in a way that shows their innocence and immaturity, yet at the same time, they have a heartbreaking knowledge of death. These moments of children being children, despite their trauma, give the play a texture that prevents it from just being a work of unmitigated tragedy, although in some ways it is that too. It is in part for this reason that Miriam Mole was celebrated by Arciszewska's colleagues. Writings about Arciszewska by her male Yiddish literary contemporaries covered a variety of topics, including praise of Miriam Mole, fascination with Arciszewska's illustrious Hasidic lineage and eccentric sense of style, and dismay about communist participation in her funeral. Yet many of these texts followed certain patterns, often damning Arciszewska's contributions with faint praise and evaluating her work with respect to her gender. From what I can tell, this reception became much more positive after Miriam Mole's completion in the 1950s. In a chapter in his book, Mein Lexikon, that was originally written in 1936, writer Melech Ravitch writes condescendingly about an early version of Arciszewska's dramatic cycle, Miriam Mole. And he writes about it as if it were a work of feminine delicacy that could also maybe be credited to Peretz. To add insult to injury, he accuses Arciszewska, who, if you'll recall, grew up in a pious Hasidic family in central Poland and was a member of Peretz's literary salon, but he claims that, or he accuses her of not really knowing Yiddish. Ravitch even lauds Arciszewska in between his dismissive comments. One of the elements Faith Jones discusses in her essay, How to Suppress Yiddish Women's Writing, and she calls this the whiplash effect. And he does all this while referring to Arciszewska by a nickname, Tocha, which you might have recalled from the trunk. So he writes, Tocha also wrote a drama in Yiddish with Latin characters, which was as tender as if it were written with the downy end of a quill on spider webs. The drama was not printed, and that is a shame. She had in her a real Peretz-like mysticism, like in his play Nokvora. Tocha did not claim to have talent as a writer. Ravitch's piece compares a play about pogroms to something written on cobwebs with the fluffy end of a feather, presumably because it was written by a woman. This quote is only the most egregious example of how Arciszewska's colleagues addressed her work in gendered terms. Yet by the time Miriam Mole was published in the 1950s, the reception was much more respectful. Everyone seemed to love the play and appreciate its brilliance. Even Ravitch had words of praise for the play, which helped shed light on its development over time. He writes, and you notice here that he's referring to her as Taya Artsychevska, not as Tocha. Taya Artsychevska wrote the drama Miriam Mole over the course of more than 30 years, rewrote the work countless times. She lived with the drama. It so happened that I was the first Yiddish writer to whom, roughly 30 years ago, Taya Artsychevska read the first version of the drama Miriam Mole, which was then less than half the size and also half the quality of its current flawless form. Ravitch indicates that the published version of Miryeml was longer and in his mind, better written than the draft so many years before. He gives the impression that Arciszewska rewrote it frequently. Cynically, we may wonder if Ravitch's newfound enthusiasm is a reflection of the artistic merit of the final form, or a recognition of the approval of male colleagues, mixed in perhaps with respect for Arciszewska as a representative of a lost world. We may question Ravitch's reliability as a source here, but his account is one of the most detailed I have found thus far. For the rest of my talk, I'd like to focus on elements of Miryeml that make it a masterpiece of modern Yiddish literature and an important work of Holocaust literature. Specifically, I'll discuss the play's victim-centered narrative, the motifs from Jewish folklore, and the play's modernism. Films, literature, and teaching materials about the Holocaust often focus on the choices made by perpetrators rather than the experiences of victims. It can be difficult to put yourself in the shoes of people who have been degraded and have many fewer options for making choices about their lives. Yiddish literature about the Holocaust resists this usual approach because it was written by Jews for Jews, and both authors and audiences generally weren't far removed from the millions of Jews that were persecuted and in many cases murdered during the Holocaust. The play Miryeml is a powerful contribution to this discussion because it focuses on children who are aware of their own experiences, but have little knowledge of the larger political and historical context. The perpetrators never appear on stage, their motives are never fully explained, and their identity is never specified. For instance, in a speech in scene 4 in Miryeml, Rochela, who is either 11 or 12, narrates a very traumatic incident in which she and other Jews have to pretend to be dead, and some of them end up being killed. So I'm going to show it on screen. I'm not going to read it out loud, but I will talk about it. This is a heartbreaking passage. It's violent. There's a sense of powerlessness and of a parent making a choiceless choice about how to save their child. The brutality is contrasted with the beauty of nature near the end, and everything is narrated by a child who is aware of this horror. Yet what I find particularly relevant here is that the perpetrators get called bad men and they, instead of getting an identity. And the scribe dismisses Cyrilla when she tries to ask why they do it. In short, the victims are humanized and their suffering is explained in detail, whereas the perpetrators are described in vague and unspecific terms. Miryeml is a work that demands that we focused on the victims of persecution, and particularly child victims, rather than the perpetrators. Miryeml gains a rich texture because of how it engages with Jewish folklore. Many works about the Holocaust, especially for children, tend to have protagonists who are acculturated Jews or are Gentiles. All of the characters in Miryeml are Hasidic, and the children make sense of the world through this lens. For instance, they console each other by telling stories of Rebbes or talking about messianic redemption. They also play games that reenact weddings or play out buying goods from a store or depict the treatment of servants. These activities can often be quite critical of economic inequality in traditional Jewish society, since the children who pretend to be rich abuse the children who portray servants and beggars. Yet at the same time, these games also reflect what children would have heard about Jewish beliefs and customs. I'd like to share an example with you from scene 7 that shows the way the children discuss these ideas and also gives you a sense of how Miryeml engages with the speech of other characters. So Motala says, the butcher's wife said, if the Messiah doesn't come now, surely he'll never come. Children, don't talk like that. You can't. Cyrilla, it's written clearly in the Torah. Jews are a blessed people. Miryeml, when you're blessed, you get a test. Melech, God's chosen the people of Israel. Cyrilla, that's what's written in the holy books. Miriam Mole, written on vellum, and yet they expel them. Cyrilla, did you know that Jews buy back the sins of the whole world and repent for all generations, for strangers and for family? My mama of blessed memory told me herself. There's no changing fate. As you see, Miriam pushes back against some of the things the other children say, and her lines also rhyme with theirs. This rhyming complicates the realism of the play and helps contribute to its modernism, which is the last. Okay. All right. Well, I'll talk about the modernism, although I think there's a, yeah, I'll talk a bit about the modernism, but briefly, so we can get to the conclusion. So Arciszewska's play is deeply invested in Jewish communal life, but it's also a modernist work. And Miryeml's rhymed speeches are not intended to be realistic. They often sound like incantations. She seems to take delight in scaring other children, and her words convey the grim context, even if historical events are not made explicit. And one example is she tells this story that's like this to the other children that reminds me of the grandmother's black fairy tale, which is this grim sort of story that takes place in Georg Büchner's play Wojciech, which is a classic of German, well, you could say modernism, but that's sort of tricky because it's a play that was originally written in the early 19th century and first published in the late 19th century. But it's very modernist in a lot of its style and its experimentalism. And so this grandmother's dark fairy tale is told, it's very depressing. It's all about death and alienation and a child who is alone because everybody is dead. And this is told right before the murder that is pretty central, or very central, to this play Wojciech. So in Miriam Mole, there's a similar speech by Miriam Mole where she tells a story to the children. I don't have a side-by-side comparison of the two speeches, but when Miriam Mole speaks, she says, I know the story of a black land, a black sun, a black sky. In the sky, there's a black clock and black watch hands tick. Coming out from all the fields, from all the houses, from all the gates, from all the doors are dead people going about their day. Black corpses are carried outside, wrapped in prayer shawls. They walk through the snow, one following another, and black people, black clothes, black houses, black window panes. Everything is black. The earth is black. Children, children, did you hear? Listen, someone's been killed with a shot to the heart. So this is a powerful passage, but also uses the word black in a negative sense that is more complicated for English language readers today. And both of these speeches, the one in Wojciech and the one here in Miriam Mole, are examples of women telling children strange and depressing stories as a way of reflecting on the grim social conditions experienced by characters in the respective plays. And they also both immediately precede acts of violence, the murder in Wojciech and Miriam Mole's announcement that someone has been shot. In both of these speeches, there is an implicit contrast between the way the children are often viewed as symbols of innocence or hope and the morbidity of the two stories, as is demonstrated by the Grimm's fairy tales in the German literary tradition. Stories for children can be brutal, yet the harsh punishments administered in the Grimm's fairy tales generally convey a sense of delivering justice or contributing some sense of moral message. In these two speeches, however, the bleakness of the fairy tales underscores a sense of alienation from a world in disarray, a frequent motif in global modernism. These stories demonstrate, furthermore, that children are not exempt from the senseless cruelties of the world. So, okay, So I'll conclude with some final remarks about the project I'm developing. My book-length English translation will consist of a biographical essay, an annotated version of the play based on the 1958 Canadian edition of Miriam Mole, and an appendix of secondary materials about Arciszewska's life. I intend to publish a book that can be used in high school and university classes and would allow students to discuss or even perform the effects of traumatic historical events on children. Both plays and literary texts about children can be used to make difficult topics more relatable for a contemporary audience. What's more, particularly when considers the introduction and appendix, my project could serve as an accessible, authoritative tool for students in Holocaust studies classes. At this point, I'd like to say a few words about why my appendix is important, not just for contextualizing Arciszewska's life and legacy, but also for thinking more broadly about the reception of women Yiddish cultural figures. Scholars such as Faith Jones, Alison Schachter, Ayelet Brin, Jessica Kurzane, and Anita Norwich, to name only a few, have noted the complicated reception of women who wrote in Yiddish. Male critics welcomed the idea of women writers in Yiddish, yet often reacted with scorn and condescension when their female colleagues did not follow their narrow ideas of what women should write about. And that's also something that Catherine Hellerstein has discussed. Scholars have acknowledged this at times dismissive treatment, yet for the most part, the primary texts have only been available in Yiddish, and those who do not read the language must rely on brief quotes and assessments of others when evaluating the critical response. In this context, assembling a body of translated texts about a single Yiddish woman writer would make this reception history more legible to people, including students, who are unable to read these texts in the original language. Scholars who work on recovering forgotten writers often get asked if these writers were any good. I'm pleased to say that Arciszewska's work was considered good, yet she nonetheless faced a lot of issues that were common for her gender and genre. In my talk today, I've discussed my ongoing project to translate Miriam Mole, uncover more information about Taya Artsychevska's life, and contextualize the playwright's reception through an appendix of primary texts by her contemporaries. There is still a lot of uncovering left to do, but I hope you'll agree with me and with Opatoshu that this is a powerful work and unique project that will help us better understand Yiddish women's writing and post-Holocaust Yiddish theater. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating presentation. There's already lots of questions. Perhaps you can end the screen share.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you again. Okay, so one viewer is asking, can you tell us anything about Taya Artsychevska's other writing? Did she write in other genres, or was this her primary output?
So she did, thank you so much for this question. And this is actually something I'm still exploring. So she definitely did write in other genres. There is, for instance, an essay that she wrote about her relationship with parrots that was in an anthology published post-war, I think actually edited by Melech Ravitch, about Polish Yiddish literature. She wrote in a Parisian Yiddish journal, Für unsere Kinder, and she also published at least one poem. There's a stanza of this poem that I have a translation of in a piece that I wrote for the Digital Yiddish Theatre Project. But as far as I know, there isn't an archive of her work. So actually, one of the things I'm hoping to do this summer is go and visit the archives and get to look for and at more of her writings. The play is definitely the work that's universally understood to be her best, or her most, the work that really established her literary reputation.
We have some questions about, I think you mentioned that we're not sure if the play was ever performed. Was that right? Mm-hmm. Do you know if the intention was that it would be performed by children actors, or is that something that's known?
So I wouldn't recommend this play to be performed by children actors. I'm hoping to mount some sort of performance at some point. It might be possible to work with students, but I think this would be a difficult play for 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 10-year-olds to play on account of both the sophistication as a modernist work, but also because of some of the cruelty that's represented in it. There was one review that I read that appeared after the play was published, and the reviewer was like, yeah, I'm so happy to have it in my hands. I love this play, and I don't think it could ever be performed, and explain some of the changes that maybe could be made. And one of the issues is that there are a lot of characters, and a lot of times for a theater company, that's difficult to do, especially for a work that isn't particularly well known. But I'm hopeful that there will be a way of staging it or doing a reading at least, because it's a really incredible work.
Yeah, I can say from some of the comments and the questions here that many people are curious to read the whole things, or looking forward to your forthcoming volume. So definitely keep us all posted with that. Another viewer asks about that. There was a quote referring to the play having been written in Latin letters. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because also you showed the title, which was very much in Oisius.
So I don't. It's hard to know what to make of that particular quote. It was clearly published in Yiddish Oisius, and there's nothing about Arciszewska's biography as somebody who grew up in this like deeply Jewish milieu that she would not know Yiddish. But Ravitch is particularly harsh in terms of how he writes about her in this 1936 piece, where he says things that are undermining her knowledge of Yiddish. And my understanding is that some of these writers who were really like sort of trying to build up modern Yiddish literature was how they sort of pushed other people down. Most of the other condescending comments about her are more related to her appearance. Like there's several writers who, when they're describing her acting, say that she was like physically too small, that the stage seemed to gobble her up, that her voice was too weak. So these are definitely things that are related to her stature. There isn't, I think Ravitch is the only person who is really questioning her Yiddish that I've seen so far. And other people were much more positive. She was viewed as being a friend of artists. She was a salonière. She may have financially supported artists. There's some indications that she did that. There's one piece that talks about how she donated a cemetery plot to a penniless artist who had died in Warsaw, who was buried next to her child who had died early, or in the same grave, but she had donated a cemetery plot, and this was seen as a sign of how generous she was towards artists, as well as being, involved in this artistic milieu. So I haven't found any other corroboration that she would have done this. Although it seems like her Polish must have been excellent, because she survived the war on the Aryan side, so she was probably pretending that she wasn't Jewish.
One viewer is asking about the use of rhyme in one of the excerpts that you showed. What is the relationship between the traditional use of rhyme in Yiddish for humorous purposes and Miryeml's rhyming? Does it tend towards mockery? Is all of her dialogue rhymed, or only some of these sections that you were showing us?
So thank you. So the rhyming happens a lot of the time, but not all of the time. Sometimes it seems to be mocking, but I think a lot of it is sort of enhancing her difference in a way that makes her prophet-like qualities, that it seems almost like she's like chanting spells, or like, and also like it relates to the ways in which she's depicted as being meshuga, being insane.
Apropos of that, what the comment about the relationship with Miriam, the prophetess from the Bible, it reminded me of some of Catherine Hellerstein's work on the influence of Techinas on poetry by women Yiddish writers. And I was wondering if you think that there's a connection there in the use of Miriam as a reference point.
I think that would definitely be something worth exploring. One thing that's interesting is that in Trunk's description of Arciszewska, he just says that it was basically as if her husband had brought a living Sora Bas Toivim, so this most famous woman writer of Techinas, to Peretz's salon. So even if it's sort of questionable about the direct connection between Miriam Mole's speech and Techinas, although that's something that would be worthwhile for me to look into more, it seems like she was being associated herself with this writer of Techinas.
Very interesting. Another viewer asks, was the reaction of male Yiddish writers to female writers in, quote, traditionally feminine genres, such as light poetry or children's literature, significantly different than the reception of these writers in drama or novels?
That's what I'm hoping to find out over the coming years. We have some writings that male Yiddish writers wrote about their hopes for Yiddish writers and Yiddish women writers, where they thought that on one hand, they viewed it as a positive thing if women were writers, because that was a sign of a thriving modern literature. But then on the other hand, they sometimes had very clearly defined ideas about what women wrote about, and then it could get complicated if women wanted to write about different things than what they thought that women should write about. So we definitely have pieces that were written about women writers in that context. I'm early in the stage, early on in my project of looking more broadly at women who wrote plays. So I've been like trying to find the playwrights and working on this translation. But a next step would be to try and see what sorts of reviews were written about the works that were staged, and whether we get any sort of more broad conceptions about how critics or male critics viewed these plays as fitting into their ideas about what women should write about.
Very interesting. Another question has come in. If Taya Artsychevska was able to help others generously, it sounds as though perhaps she was financially comfortable. Did her work generate a viable income, or do we know if she had wealth from another means?
This is one of the questions I've had as well, so thank you for that. I mean, her family was wealthy, but I'm not sure if they were financially supporting her after she eloped and at other stages of her life. So it's not quite clear to me about these things. When she came to Warsaw from Palestine, the description Trunk has, she seems like she just like brought so much stuff. Like there's brocades, oil lamps, antique jewelry. There's just like all of these different items, and like so much of what's written about her, and also to a certain extent what she writes in the play, it's just like catalogs of different items that have, and these like material objects like have some sort of sense of like mystery and power about them, which is really interesting. Like when Trunk writes about how she decided to become an actress, it's about her like going into a trunk and like looking through like garments that had belonged to her grandmother and trying them on in the mirror, and then like sort of like thinking about being an actress. And then in the play itself, there's like the children find like this trunk that has these like, you know, the same sort of objects, and then they're like playing with them. And so that part's all very interesting, but I'm not entirely sure of like where the money came to be able to do this sort of thing.
Fascinating. And just a final question, looking more broadly with your work with the Digital Yiddish Theatre Project, and the kind of movement of translating and unearthing and writing a scholarship on this long overlooked repertoire written by Yiddish women writers, how do you think the the field of Yiddish theater is, the conception of it is changing with all of the scholarship that's being added. Do you have any sense of where that's going to take us?
So I will say that when I was finishing up my PhD, I had an idea for another project, for a second project, which was about dance and German anti-Semitism. And I thought that would be the next project that I worked on. And it quickly became apparent to me when I started getting involved in this that if I didn't sort of start writing about women who wrote plays in Yiddish, that somebody was going to come in quickly and do that, because it's just been so tremendous how much interest there has been in finding out this information. So we have this volume coming out that Miriam Siegel and Alyssa Quinn are editing on women on the Yiddish stage, and that's like also accompanied by some translations of memoirs by women that are on the Digital Yiddish Theatre Project. There's been other sorts of translation initiatives. There's a series at the Volksbühne Theater, and there have been a number of other play translations that have been supported by the Yiddish Book Center Fellowship, starting with Zisel Piazza's translation of the first play that we know of, that was written by a woman, Diaguna, the Chained Wife. And so we're going to start seeing these translations come out published like in their entirety. Like for instance, I'm co-editing with Joel Berkowitz and Nick Underwood a special issue on Schund that's going to appear in Geweb, hopefully in the winter. And Vivi Laux has a translation of a one-act play that's going to be published along with that. So things are going to be happening really quickly, and it's really exciting. And I'm really happy to be contributing to that effort. And I encourage everybody who tuned in today to keep watching, because there's a lot of really interesting projects that are going on and that will start really becoming visible to all kinds of people.
Well, Dr. Gollance, thank you so much for your work and for sharing it with us today. And we're all looking forward to following it in the future.
Thank you.